Good evening. Welcome to this author and book signing event with our guest author, Dr. Justin Farrell. Dr. Farrell is accompanied by his wife, Ashley. We welcome you, Mrs. Farrell. Copies of Justin Farrell's book, The Battle for Yellowstone, praised by The Economist as the most original political book of early 2015, and named one of Choice's outstanding academic titles for 2015, which we hope you will purchase and have signed, are available at the hallway table. You're invited following Justin's presentation to join us in the hallway for book signing and a reception as we conclude the evening. Justin Farrell is Assistant Professor of Sociology at Yale University, a 2009 graduate of Princeton Theological Seminary, with a doctorate in sociology from the University of Notre Dame. As a sociologist, he describes himself as studying culture, environment, and social movements, using a mixture of methods from large-scale computational text analysis, qualitative fieldwork, network science, and machine learning. His record of publication, in addition to his book, includes a telling study of corporate funding and climate change, and among other publications, an award-winning article on Klan activism. The recipient of numerous grants and fellowships, Dr. Farrell is presently Publications Committee Chair of the American Sociological Association's section on environment and technology. His sociological work is animated by a clear sense of concern to understand the value systems at work in the many manifestations of culture. And we may expect his continuing insights to inform and challenge us this evening. Please join me in welcoming Justin Farrell.
Well, thank you all for coming. This really is a special moment for me, graduating from this institution and being back. As Don said, I graduated in 2009 and studied religion and society mainly when I was here, and worked here at the seminary, and then also for Professor Robert Withnow over at the university in the sociology department. And so it was really a time for me, academic growth, but really personal growth. Ashley and I moved here just 2 weeks after we were married and kind of started our lives. And that was 9.5 years ago, and kind of it's crazy how things can change. And so it's really a pleasure to be here. And I just want to share with you a little bit about my book, kind of give you a broad overview, introduce the main themes, and then take questions, and hopefully we can have an interesting discussion too. As Don mentioned, I'm a professor of sociology at Yale, and I work in the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, and then jointly appointed in sociology as well. And so I get to interact with a lot of really interesting students. At dinner I was saying that, last semester I had in my class students from law, divinity, public health, and just on and on and on. And so a lot of what I try to do is kind of inform students about the cultural basis of decision making about the environment, about values, and how they matter. And that's really what the point of this book is. And so I'll just begin kind of giving a background for those of you who are maybe unfamiliar with the Yellowstone area, which is the focus of the book. It's Yellowstone. It really holds a special place in America's heart. It's our young nation's Eden, it's called by many, and really the crown jewel of modern preservation. It's the world's first national park And it's really globally recognized as really the prototype of natural purity, of natural goodness, and it is Yellowstone, I guess we should just say. But in recent decades, Yellowstone and its surrounding areas have really become a lightning rod for environmental controversy. And you may all have seen some of this in the news. It's an area that's often plagued by social disunity and intractable political struggle. And this battle for Yellowstone, as I call it, the topic of the book, has really become one of the most symbolically important examples of environmental conflict today. So just to kind of give you here more of the overview, the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, of which Yellowstone is a part, you can see that in the white there, that is Yellowstone. And since the 1980s, it's been referred to as the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So the greater Yellowstone ecosystem refers to this wide area around Yellowstone, about 20 million acres around that the greater Yellowstone ecosystem comprises. Yellowstone itself is about 4 million acres there in the middle. So the whole idea behind this is expanding the footprint of management to account for, when animals might leave the park and they don't, pay attention to these boundaries. There's not a fence or anything like that. And so the idea was we need to manage outside of that. Well, the problem with that are there are a lot of different communities outside of the park with lots of different folks and different views on things and different ways of life. And it's caused a lot of conflict, and that's really what I focus on. In addition to the vast wildlife populations, actually, how many of you all have been to Yellowstone, that area? Just kind of get a feeling. Okay, most of you, cool. So you may have seen some of these wildlife. Hopefully not grizzly bears too close, but it's home to many small and mid-sized rural communities as well that are scattered out throughout its 20 counties. So there's about 500,000 locals, and there's really been extraordinary population growth the past few decades in some of these towns, and more land development, and with that, economic change. But what I really try to focus on is cultural change. With the socioeconomic change that has happened, how has that shifted cultural views and values and those sorts of things? And I'll return to that. So the conflicts. I'm sure some of you might be familiar with the ongoing conflicts. They include struggles over wolf reintroduction, grizzly bear and bison management, oil extraction, natural gas fracking, the viability of ranching, the explosion of tourism, motorized recreation in and around the park, and those sorts of things. And these are a few pictures of just kind of examples of conflict. We were just out, I took a field course, some students out to the bottom left picture is a natural gas rig in Pinedale, Wyoming, which is just south of Yellowstone, and saw some of that. The top is a wolf protest in Jackson Hole in the town square, and then the bottom right is a buffalo protest, and I'll get into that a little bit. But these conflicts, they cycle in and out of the courts, often for decades at a time. They consume millions of private and public dollars for scientific research, for legal costs, political lobbying, and more often than not, when policy issues are kind of reached, they're short-lived, and as competing interest groups lobby for more science, more technical expertise, more political favor, or public input to try to stall rulings or overturn rulings. And so it's just intractable, and they've gotten worse. Many of them have gotten worse over time. So there's a massive effort, as I kind of mentioned, of both inside and outside the greater Yellowstone ecosystem by natural scientists and others to supply a technical expertise to these problems. And that's, in my view, a good thing, but I'll kind of get to the problem with that. So, alongside natural scientists are groups of economists, lawyers, policy experts, and other technically geared folks really working diligently on these contentious issues. They're creating a flurry of biological research, of economic valuation, legal scrutiny, and these sorts of things in hopes of providing enough scientific, empirical data and analysis and evidence to resolve these conflicts. So that's kind of the approach they take to it. which I've called in the book, summarized as a techno-scientific approach. And so then when management decisions are made on some of these conflicts, they rely on this approach heavily. Again, as they should kind of get to this. But this has kind of formed a puzzle in my mind about, with all of this, this data, this empirical expertise, why are matters not improving? Why are these political efforts so unending? And why is there rarely progress? So that was kind of the puzzle that I experienced. And so I found that, while these approaches really matter a great deal and they're very important to making decisions, they're incomplete. They tell us more about how conflict happens than why it happens. So I'm trying to get to the why. Let's kind of get back to the values, to the different cultural approaches. And so really to put it in my broadest terms, and I talk about this a lot in the introduction of my book, is, my argument is that the modern obsession with scientific, legal, economic reasoning misses out on deeper cultural mechanisms that motivate conflict in the first place. It's not that they don't matter, it's just that we miss out on, I think, drivers of the conflict, more foundational aspects. And so I really try in this book to reorient the attention in this area, and even on environmental conflict in general, in academia or in the practice of it. And when I talk with my students, many of them who will go work for organizations, I really try to orient them toward the why questions that really make life meaningful in the first place. So what really propels us toward different ends when we wake up in the morning? What do we really care about at a deeper level? These sorts of things. And so these are the sorts of why questions that I think we need to really incorporate, not only into our academic theories and methods, but really if we're really trying to understand the human-environment relationship more generally. So I'll talk a little bit about how I try to investigate that empirically. And it really has led me to the study of culture, the social scientific study of culture and morality. So morality, try to get to that here. So by moral, I mean an orientation toward right and wrong, toward good and bad, toward just and unjust, these sorts of things, worthy, unworthy. And moral commitments shape basic practices, really ranging from how we treat friends, family, coworkers, public and political practices relating to civil rights, poverty, cultural wars, biomedical ethics. I'm sure it's kind of interesting giving a talk here because I know that many are probably familiar with these sorts of things. I just gave a talk to a bunch of conservationists in Bozeman, and I think it's like trying to convince them of this or trying to kind of describe this is a little different than here. It's kind of nice. But so I think you all, I imagine, understand. So about morality in general. And so for my purposes, I look at it, in relation to the natural environment. So how does all this relate to conflict? Well, I think, a fundamental motivation for human behavior and social conflict is, I argue, to struggle to enact and sustain moral orders that we have, these moral beliefs that we hold. So some that we might ask, are biologically intact ecosystems better than disrupted or fragmented ones? Is it better to have a holistic ecosystem or not? These kind of obvious questions. Do animals have intrinsic rights apart from their instrumental value to humans? Are humans only one small part of nature, or are they sovereign over it and can do what they want? Why should we care about a place like Yellowstone in the first place? Does nature have intrinsic value? Does it have spiritual value? These sorts of questions. And these questions are really, in the end, not resolved by natural science or economics. Because by their very nature, they're only meaningful within these larger moral commitments we have and these views we have about nature and humanity. So they're really at their root moral, philosophical, and spiritual questions. And that's what I'm really trying to get at. And what I found kind of overall is when these different views on these issues are held, they become incommensurable. And it's very difficult when two sides kind of hold these different views about nature to overcome that. So I'm not going to go into this too much more, but 3 just quick points that raise questions that I deal with in the book. One, what are humans that they construct these belief systems? So again, I think every human believes in something. We kind of go about our day doing things based on these beliefs we have about what's good or bad, or kind of how we ought to live, or what kind of life we want to lead. And they're really embedded within our own cultural context and kind of where we get those in our institutions. But these beliefs aren't really constructed in a vacuum. They're linked to larger narratives who tell us who we are, why we are, what we're doing, and why it all matters. So our understanding of the natural environment is embedded within these narratives. So, for example, some narratives that I encountered in my field work, rugged individualism, manifest destiny, again, human dominion over nature, belief that nature is sacred, or maybe a strong faith in scientific progress. And then lastly, again, people strive to enact and sustain these moral orders, that they really have consequences for social life. So in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, no amount of empirical evidence can adjudicate different moral visions about what nature is good for. They can help with it after you kind of have this foundational belief, and then you kind of move from there. But again, conflict can become really especially long-lasting and bitter in cases like these. So oftentimes I found that people talk past each other because they present evidence at one level when what they're arguing about really has to do with what's right or wrong and how it fits into their story about who they are as people. So again, you might think of an environmentalist who moves there, maybe someone who graduates from the school that I teach in, goes out there and encounters a rancher who has lived there for generations, and they see the land very differently. And it's based on their experiences, it's based on how they were raised, and it's a lot of times difficult for them to kind of see beyond that. And so if there's a conflict, for example, which I'll get into a few of the case studies, they're arguing about maybe some scientific fact about a wolf when we kind of got to go back to a more first order foundational disagreement that they have that we need to talk about and bring it out. But that's very difficult to do, and a lot of times folks aren't even aware of kind of what they believe unless they stop and think about it or you talk to them about it. Kind of just move along with their lives a lot of times. So my approach in the book, which is again very different, I think, than approaches to environmental conflict within different academic circles, is that I really try to get into these issues, and the one way I do this is socio-historical evidence. I think this is an incredibly important piece of the puzzle. And what is the cultural context that people in this area are now living? Within which moral and spiritual ideas about Yellowstone emerged in history, and how have they grown and changed? So in the introduction, in the first chapter of the book, I talk a lot about how Yellowstone itself has changed from being viewed as kind of like, it's looked at like a natural resource. Now it's then it went through a transformation to kind of a spiritual resource, and now blended with a scientific, spiritual kind of themes going on right now and how it's viewed. And a lot of that has to do with how Americans view it from outside and all these different things. And so that's all traced in a historical framework and different stories about that. And then second, I really try to get in depth in what's going on today. And these are through case studies of contemporary conflicts to really demonstrate, and the whole goal of this is to demonstrate how these moral commitments that I kind of just laid out, how they influence in different ways these ongoing political struggles. So it's one thing to say kind of, here's kind of some philosophy about morality, or here's kind of how different cultures work. It's another to really try to show it in real life and talk with real people and kind of examine how it's actually happening, which I think is really interesting, but it really takes talking with folks, observing, and these different social scientific methods that we have to do that. So the case studies I look at are the bison conflict, wolf conflict, and then conflict over natural gas drilling in the area. To accomplish this, I rely on three sources of data. One, again, the quantitative indicators of broader social and moral change in the region. And a lot of this social change, which I argue has moral implications, is drawn from like the U.S. Census, Bureau of Economic Analysis, the IRS, and looking at kind of who was there before, who's been showing up lately, how that's changed things. I think the example about, a conservationist moving out there and encountering a rancher who's been there for a few generations is a good example of kind of looking at, where does kind of most income come from now? Is it ranching? Is it mining? Or has that changed? Second, I look at, I don't like that word big data, I need to remove it, but basically large-scale text collections. And so I apply computational content analysis, which is basically looking, identifying themes within text using computer programs. Has anybody heard of the digital humanities? Yeah, okay, one person. You're either a librarian. Essentially, it's, I collected several 100,000 public comment letters that were written about the wolf issue, the bison issue, and I don't have time to read several 100,000 documents that Americans have written in saying why they love or hate wolves, why they love or hate bison. And so you basically have computer-assisted techniques. In the climate change work that you mentioned, it's the same thing. I had like 39 million documents, and how am I going to, I can't read those. And so, unless I had enough money for RAs, but I still wouldn't cover it. So essentially, what I did here is collect public comment letters that were written when the government is looking to make a decision on, say, wolves or something. They'll solicit public comment. It's part of the law, the NEPA process. And so anyone can write a letter. And I looked at these and kind of say, what themes are going on in here? What do people actually care about when they write about a wolf? Are they talking about the science of it? Are they talking about wolves are sacred creatures or something like that? Or are they talking about, they complete the ecosystem, or what language are they using? And so what I did was pair this sort of high-level quantitative analysis with in-depth ethnographic observation, which essentially means going to the area and spending a lot of time there, talking with a lot of different people, observing, say if there was a public meeting held about this issue, what are people saying, what are they arguing about, conducting interviews with folks in the area. So these are much richer data in a lot of ways. I really enjoy this sort of research. It's hard work, setting up interviews and all those sorts of things, but I also lived full-time with for a couple weeks in the spring with an activist group in the area who lives in basically a commune, and participated in all of their activities. And that was for the buffalo issue, and I'll show you a few pictures of that and tell you a little bit about that issue. So it's a range of data, but I really think that this approach helps to triangulate what's actually going on rather than just relying on economic data or just being on the ground. So that's kind of my approach. So real quickly, this historical kind of story that I tell in the book, in the late 19th and early 20th century, nature in America, especially Yellowstone, really changed from being something that was viewed as instrumental or utilitarian. Essentially, it only had value if it was economic value or sustenance, to something that really had moral and religious value. That picture back there is our bison skulls waiting to be ground up. Bison were hunted to near extinction. I think that picture was actually recreated in The Revenant. I don't know if anybody has seen that movie, but I think they redid that. It's really interesting. I didn't take it, obviously. And so what I'm trying to show is that standing on top of thousands and thousands of bison skulls that were used, and then the fur trapping that was happening for hats that were shipped out east, has really shifted. And then I have this picture of Yellowstone, a place that's set apart. And so things have really changed in a big way. And so I get into this in a whole chapter. about Yellowstone and what it means really for America in general. So then in my quest to understand socio-historical causes of conflict, I've zeroed in on this dichotomy that I call the Old West and the New West. And so this typology that I have are two categories that I think are useful for understanding how the area has changed in recent years. And of course, I mean, these are kind of two broad categories that I think are really useful, but obviously everyone doesn't fall within that who lives out here. So to paint with a broad brush, Old West refers to, as this picture on the left, communities who I group by different counties, who typify many rural American communities in the sense that their way of life is very, morally homogenous in the sense of it's defined by farming, ranching, mining, timber. That's their sort of interaction with the land, or was and is. And so it's a utilitarian approach, but it's also, I found, very deeply meaningful for the folks who participate in this. And it's tied to heritage, and it's tied to all sorts of ways of Old West ways of life. They're still very important, and are manifested in different ways. But then the New West signifies growth. It signifies recreation, aesthetic values, environmental values, tourism, these sorts of things. And throughout the book, how do I put this? I don't really take a normative stance on these things. My wife Ash says I never have an opinion on anything. I have my personal opinions, but I really try to just describe things and really try to just kind of show in objective ways you can what's happening. And that's really is my goal. And I think we all sort of have let our own biases sneak in here and there, but that's kind of my approach here. And so the Old West and the New West, so when I talked to, actually I gave a talk at a class in the political science department on Tuesday, and the professor that I was presenting in his class, he was kind of upset because I was way too easy on the Old Westerners. I should have just, they're ruining the area and all this different stuff. And I said, it's not really my job. I don't see it as that. And so my hope is to kind of provide information for students that I teach or whoever, that they can take it and then kind of do with it what they want. So basically what I found is you have this Old West, New West dichotomy, but then you have all those different towns around Yellowstone. You have different national forests, different layers of government. You have state government. You have federal government, which is a huge issue, the federal government, as we saw in that refuge in Oregon, these sorts of issues going on. And these different epistemologies and moral stances about what nature is good for and how it ought to be used in that way or not. And so this is really a social context that's really ripe for moral disagreement and eventual conflict. So these case studies, so the first couple of chapters of the book lay out the material I just presented. Then the last three are really kind of the heart of my findings, and it's where I get more into telling the stories that I found, and there's three of them. The first is the Buffalo conflict. So this was a conflict. I won't go into all the details. Read the book if you want, or ask me after. There's a conflict over buffalo roaming outside of the park, and the key thing here is that, like I mentioned before, buffalo were hunted to near extinction. There were 23 buffalo left after 30 million. So those 23 were in Yellowstone, and those are the only genetically pure buffalo that haven't been mated with cattle. And they've built it up to like 3,000 to 5,000 is the herd now that still is in Yellowstone. They migrate outside of the park, but when they leave the park, they're going on to private property mostly. And that's when conflict ensues, because a rancher might not want a buffalo coming onto his or her ranch and mingling with the cattle, or even potential of spreading disease. And so this conflict has been raging on. And these pictures are from this group that I lived with, and they're some call them more extreme activist group. but they really, this was the picture on the right is one of the leaders getting arrested. They're routinely arrested. I have probably like 30 pictures in the book of different protests that they hold and things like that. So we would get up at 4 a.m. and snowshoe out and count buffalo, and with binoculars watch for government officials and all these different things to make sure the buffalo were okay. But this group was so interesting because they are built on the idea that the buffalo are sacred, that the genetic purity of the buffalo means something over and above other buffalo, and they were willing to dedicate their lives, many of them, to this cause. But the issue, when it played out in the courts, when it played out with the Park Service or whatever bureaucratic agency, wouldn't really acknowledge that as much as I think it could have. And so then you're talking about an issue at two different levels, really. So there's really a strong moral logic beneath this issue. And the text analysis, other than kind of living with this group, and I spell out kind of their approach, this is a semantic kind of network of which arguments that they use in their texts, this group, the most. And so they talk a lot about, you see in the bottom, dominionism and harm. So that it's wrong to harm these buffalo, to test them, to push them back into the park with helicopters, to chase them with four-wheelers back into the park. So they kind of go back in there. They made a lot of spiritual and religious claims, and those were often tied together. So if a theme there is closer, that means that they talked about it in the same document often. If you see the far right, they rarely made economic arguments. They rarely made, again, what would be probably an economic argument would be greed most of the time. But it was more about this moral, spiritual kind of value of the buffalo and the ways that they would talk about the buffalo to me, the ways they would talk to each other about it. When we were out in the field, it really resonated in that way with the spiritual and religious dimensions. So that was really at the root of why they were doing what they do. The second thing about this chapter that I found really interesting is it was built on one or two tribal religious creation narratives. They're this group of mostly middle class white folks, younger, were using indigenous kind of religious teachings to say that the buffalo were sacred, which is super fascinating for me because most of these activists were not religious. They hated religion. They were secular, but it was like appropriating this other religion was okay. And so like it was really interesting. Like they had this prayer circle, and I write about this in the chapter, and they were comfortable with that. But then, in conversations, I would kind of ask them about that. Like, are you personally like religious? No, I don't do religion. I'm not into that. I'm secular. Da, 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 da. And so you got into this kind of native, non-native religious. I don't know even what I would call it, but it was fascinating to me. So I called it religious muting. They would mute their own, but they were okay with others. So yeah, it was interesting. My theory for that was they viewed religion as being co-opted by the conservative movement, religious right, and so that they viewed it basically as synonymous with that. So they had no example of maybe a healthier religious tradition. And there's some work in sociology about that a little bit. But so the next one was the wolf conflict, which is, if you haven't heard about this conflict, it's probably one of the most well written about. It's one of the most contentious. Hundreds of books and articles have been written about this conflict, and it's still going on. But what I try to do again is take a fresh approach and look at it through these kind of moral, spiritual lens, and look at the narratives that are involved in pro-wolf and anti-wolf camps. And this included interviews, again, observation, and computational text analysis on public letters. So the top left is a map, and what was nice about the letters that I collected, these couple of 100,000 letters, they had the address of the folks who wrote the letters, and so I was able to plot where they wrote from. And so you can see that it's definitely not isolated to Yellowstone, which up there in the northwest corner-ish. It's from everywhere, and it really kind of reflects, I think, population density, really. It's probably pretty, that would probably map on quite well. And so what I was interested in doing was looking at what they were saying, what people were writing, but also if you were writing locally in the Yellowstone area, are you writing something different than folks who live outside of the area? And for me, it was, are people idealizing this animal from outside, and because they're not dealing with the everyday repercussions of the animal. And so the whole wolves were extirpated, and then they were reintroduced in 1995. And they were reintroduced, they were Canadian wolves, they're non-native. They were, I guess there's all sorts of arguments about that, but essentially the ones that were there are not there anymore because they were killed off, so we had to bring other ones in. So here's these kind of one of the tables of results. On the left are this anti-wolf camp, which it splits into two, pro and anti, pretty well, this issue does. The left, I have these different themes. A lot of these came from interviews with anti-wolf activists, and they fall under these kind of three large rubrics: rugged individualism, human dominionism, and simple and sacred heritage, as I call it, and for reasons for not wanting the wolf. And so my argument in this chapter is this: it's not even about the wolf, this issue. It's about the federal government. It basically is a takeoff issue for all these different disagreements a lot of these people would have about the federal government trampling on their states' rights, turning all federal land over to states. That's a big issue going on right now. And so these are kind of the categories that I found. And so let's see a couple of the distrust of outsiders. Yeah, I won't go into those. We can ask me about those if you're interested in a particular one. On the right, they're pro-wolf. So what were folks saying in these? Most of the letters that were written were actually pro-wolf letters. They were, again, critiquing human dominionism. That's the top one, that who are humans to think they're above wolves? If we're going to reintroduce wolves, we are just one among all animals in the ecosystem, and we need to deal with it. We shouldn't think we're above that. The other was the spiritual value of wolves. There were some would send pictures. There's one was this picture of this woman in lingerie with a stuffed wolf. It got really strange. It was like I don't have a category for that. I don't know, sexuality or something. And so it's just there's so much more going on than the massive amount of scientific analysis that went into this issue. I mean, it's just constant, millions of dollars spent. Say if an issue were passed, it might be reversed in D.C., then it might be sent back to Wyoming, and they just go back and forth, and so much work being done. And my whole argument is, let's at least step back and see what's important. Why is this even important to the people who are engaged in these conflicts? Another interesting interview I did was with a man who works in Chicago. He's never been to Yellowstone, but he has pictures of wolves on his desk, and he works, I think he worked in finance in Chicago. And he said that gives him enjoyment, and that gives him motivation to kind of get through his day. And I thought that was really interesting to me, that he's never even been out there, but there was this sort of idealizing the wolf as a symbol of nature and a symbol to him of maybe connection to nature and those sorts of things. And then the last one is there was a conflict over drilling or fracking, which is a form of hydraulic drilling for natural gas, just south of Jackson Hole, about an hour or so, in the Hoback Mountains. This case study was really interesting, and in the book I have it as basically a counterexample almost to all the other issues of conflict. It's terrible, things are getting worse, people aren't talking about what they need to be talking about, and then this issue is different because there was actually some resolution, and the folks who really pushed for it were all old Western types. They were the man that was on the front of the first slide I had up, and he's on the cover of the book. I interviewed in a old dusty bar south in this area, and he described how important this area was to him because he took his kids hunting to this area, and he basically the kind of same meaning that maybe a rancher would find in the land. He found that too, and that's what motivated him to actually protect it. And so he started this Citizens for the Wyoming Range, and his name is Dan, and he basically collected a lot of folks who don't like wolves, who are mostly libertarian, kind of conservative, very conservative actually, and they said, okay, we'll agree not to talk about wolves, but we'll work with conservationists on this issue, because we both think that this land, their whole thing was too special to drill, that it was sacred to them. Even though they promote drilling all across the state, it's just, let's protect this one area. Let's at least say, all right, not here. And so that was based, again, on these kind of a moral foundation that I'm saying, well, here's an example where it might work. Here's where we can find common ground between these two sides that are often at odds and don't often have a language to even talk with one another, but they found one. And so this chapter is based on a lot of interviews and observation with these folks. And so he kept saying, I'm not a tree hugger. I'm just like, and so there's a lot of interesting identity kind of factors at play, and it was really fascinating. So those are kind of the three main case studies, but basically, again, my whole goal with this book was to try to collect and tell stories of the deeper commitments that really motivate what people do, and to uncover, I think, what we often, some of us, take for granted as human beings, that, and to really try to look at that and show how it matters in conflict. And I think, to conclude, just to reiterate my main point, that if we dig deeper, I think we see that environmental conflict in Yellowstone, it's not really what it appears to be on the surface. And if you spend time out there and you read news articles or those sorts of things, you don't really see a lot of this stuff. And I'm definitely not arguing that economics or law or policy don't matter. I mean, I teach in a school where those are central, and I think they're central. But I think we often miss out on important explanations that are there too, that should be alongside these other aspects, and they're deeper sort of motivating aspects of conflict that are ignored. So I think obviously these are important questions in this case, but I also think they expand well beyond to human behavior across sort of any domain. So that's it. I'll stop there.